Good afternoon. Welcome to the October monthly policy update. People are joining the virtual conference room right now. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you for being with us. All right, I'm looking at 1 minute past the hour, and we know that you all have many important things to be doing. And if you're in Washington, D.C. and you don't have important things to be doing, I hope you're getting outside on this, maybe our last spectacular fall afternoon. So let's begin. Again, thanks for joining the October monthly policy update. I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations here at Independent Sector. If you're joining us for the first time on an IS webinar, welcome. Independent Sector is a national membership organization of nonprofits and foundations and corporate giving programs working to ensure all people living in the United States thrive. This is a webinar, so your lines are muted. We'll pause periodically for questions. You're welcome to drop those at any time into the system. Try to use the Q&A function. We will keep an eye on the chat. That's best reserved for general banter as well. If you're having any problems, email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. This webinar is generally a benefit for IS members. So if you're not an IS member and you want to join us next month too, please connect with us offline. We'd love to talk. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C., from the Independent Sector offices. This is the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area. They're working to reclaim their land and their traditional practices. Also, many of the buildings we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built by enslaved people. Wherever you're joining us from today, we hope you're honoring the legacy of that place and the present. Again, we're really glad to have you with us. I'm joined today by our trusted partners and colleagues at Washington Council, Ernst & Young, Wes Coulomb, and Jessica Cameron. Before we turn to them for some important updates on the federal landscape, I also am very excited to be joined today by Blair Abel Kaiser. Blair's the Senior Director of Government Relations at Social Current. If you don't know Social Current, you should. And maybe Blair will talk a little bit more about this, but the Social Current network touches over 12,000 human services professionals spanning over 1,800 organizations. And Blair's going to talk with us today about some important updates on federal grants reform. Maybe not always the topic that is in the headlines, but one that is top of mind for nonprofit professionals of every type very, very often in a big way. So we're excited about some of these developments. We're grateful to have Blair with us. Blair's worked in health policy on Capitol Hill. She's worked as an advocate in the nonprofit sector and as a biomedical researcher, what many of us in the policy world might call a real job. So Blair, thanks again for being with us today, and I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started.
Great.
So, as Ben mentioned, I'm here today to talk about a really important piece of legislation that's working its way through both the House and the Senate simultaneously right now, dealing with reforming, simplifying, making the federal grant-making process a lot more accessible to new organizations and organizations, nonprofit organizations that have current grants and are sort of undergoing what we all know and experience is a lot of the regulatory stress, whether it's the application process, whether it is the compliance process and the reporting process. So As Ben mentioned, I am Blair Belkaiser. I'm the Senior Director of Government Affairs at Social Current. We represent 1,800 human service organizations and human services nonprofits. Our network spans nationwide, some in Canada and some in Mexico. And because of that, we have a really broad network that really brings a lot of really interesting, thoughtful perspectives to all aspects of the grant making process. And so this sort of sudden burst of energy that we're going to talk about around reforming and aiding and improving and streamlining the grant making process really started back this summer, very surprisingly. A little bit of background. This summer, there was a hearing in, I believe, this past May, hosted by the Senate HISGAC committee, which is a nasty sounding word that for Homeland Security and Government Accountability Committee in the Senate. And that is chaired by Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. And the ranking member on that committee is the Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. And the hearing came about because the hearing focused on how federal grants sometimes don't reach or do the best job of reaching or being implemented properly in underserved communities. And this whole hearing came about because 2 or 3 small to medium-sized, not nationwide nonprofits, but 2 or 3 Michigan nonprofits with really no serious political sophistication outside of the ability to coordinate a write-in campaign to their senator, contacted Chairman Peters' office, complained about the grant-making process, and in a real testament to the power of just simple pick up your phone, pick up your email type advocacy, it spawned this hearing. And Social Current and our friends at the National Council of Nonprofits and other sort of nationwide nonprofit umbrella organizations were really given the chance to dive in, aid the committee in prepping for the hearing. We attended the hearing, and out of that hearing came some of the legislation that we're going to talk about today. But I want to first sort of highlighting the problems that we have, and I'm not going to read through all these, but these are just challenges that we have heard from in our Social Current network regarding the grant making process, and it spans nationwide. And I think some of these quotes might resonate with organizations that either you work for, organizations that you're connected with. But basically what it comes down to is that the grant making process is cumbersome. The application process is outrageously difficult. Most nonprofits have dedicated staff that work to finding the grants, sorting through the NOFOs or the notification of funding opportunities, which can be tens and 20s of hundreds of pages long with detailed application instructions to the application process. And if you're even awarded the grant, the very cumbersome, sometimes Sisyphean task of staying compliant and reporting properly to the federal government with the grant. And we heard from several network organizations that are affiliated with us that were basically such as like this one here in the bottom left corner, our Kansas-based community health provider who had a successful grant application history and had the infrastructure, got to the point to where when it came to federal grants from several large agencies in the federal government, they said, screw it, like it's too difficult, it's too much time, we're losing money. And quite frankly, because of anything from bad technical issue with the website to reporting, they were actually putting in more money and time on staying compliant and applying for the grant than the money they took in from the grant. And this is in no way a sort of a white whale situation. We hear from network organizations across the country who feel this way, and our partners and other umbrella organizations have faced the same challenges and report the same things. So with this collective sort of knowledge that we have, Ben, are you only seeing my title slide?
Yeah, hey, yeah, Blair, I'm only seeing your title slide.
Okay,
so I know that there are.
Well, that's embarrassing.
It's captivating content, whether we got slides for it or not. Now I'm looking at challenges now. Thanks.
Cool. We'll just go through it this way because yeah, this will work. So because of all this work all this sort of lived experience that Social Current and other organizations were able to lift up to the Senate committee and Senate committee staff. We were able to help and sort of provide a lot of technical assistance and a lot of feedback to what became S 2286 in the House, in the Senate, which is the Streamlining Federal Grant Act of 2023. And that's a beautiful picture that has been hanging on my office wall here at home since it was introduced this June. Just a quick run through of the grant. The objective of the grant is super simple, nonpartisan, as bipartisan as a bill gets in the Senate nowadays, and I think you'll see that through some of our co-sponsors on the legislation. The overall goal here is to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of federal grants and cooperative agreements, really focusing on simplifying application and reporting requirements and enhancing coordination among the grant-making agencies. And by enhancing coordination, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but basically making it to where if you have a system and you have a grant through one agency, the reporting requirements and even the website that you use to apply and the website you use to stay to report your compliance information or your compliance data should not just be apples and oranges from agency to agency. And this was we worked really hard with Senate staff to put together what we thought was a really nice bipartisan coalition to get this started off with. As I said, it was led by Senator Peters. Senator Cornyn of Texas is one of our lead Republican co-sponsors. Senator Langford of Oklahoma. The roster has expanded now in the Senate to Senator Braun of Indiana and Senator Senator Warnock of Georgia. Sorry. And we just actually 3 weeks ago now had the bill introduced in the House. And we have a really nice, surprising sort of set of co-sponsors in the House. It's represented, she's a freshman senator from Southwest Washington, Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, and Senator Virginia Foxx of North Carolina. And that has picked up a few co-sponsors as of today. Senator Jacobs of California has joined the bill, and their name escapes me, so I'm sorry if I have any folks from Guam who are on the webinar. But the Republican delegate from Guam has joined the bill as well. So we're picking up a nice bipartisan coalition in the House as well. So as I stated, this was sort of a little bit of more of an elaboration on the current challenges that the grants process is undergoing. You have lack of standardized rules, lack of standardized forms and policies. It's an outrageously complex, sort of amorphous blob of an organization as it pertains to grant making. 51 agencies administering 1,900 grant programs, 191 IT systems. If anyone has tried to navigate grants.gov, grants.gov is usually the shining example of what works in federal grant making online. So it's just downhill from there. And there's no standardization of those NOFOs, notice of funding opportunities, amongst the 51 agencies. And for a system that's already put together with gum and tape, in 2007, it was administering $391 billion of grants. And as of 2022, that number has skyrocketed to 1.13 trillion. So it wasn't a productive system when it was only handling $500 million, and now it's handling a little bit north of $1 trillion, and it has not gotten any better, not surprisingly. So just real quick, we can talk about what's in the grant. Specifically, there's a real focus on making sure that changes that happen to the grant-making process serve underserved communities. So these are coordination and standardization that I talked about between grant-making agencies that are going to benefit small, rural, less resourced communities and the nonprofits that inhabit those communities who don't have a dedicated grants application person for a HUD grant versus an HHS grant, or someone who's really adept at going through grants.gov as opposed to a more Byzantine like HUD system. This is the mandatory consultation part is something we really fought and championed for inclusion in the bill with both Republican and Democratic staff, is mandatory consultation. agencies are going to have to engage with underserved community during this grant improvement process, and that engagement will require consultation with nonprofits that operate in these underserved communities. NOFOs are going to be reformed. Those notice of funding opportunities be clear, concise, clear, and accessible. The goal being a NOFO of 500 words or less, which if you're in the grant making world is a miracle and would save tons and tons and tons of time. And finally, an improvement, asking grant making agencies to improve, shore up, figure out ways to improve their training and assistance process, improving their customer service, and providing support for applicants. This is especially important because we hear from organizations all the time in our network who are like, I'm a player, I'm applying for a grant through HHS, just off the top of my head. And we're really struggling. We really think we have a really good case to make in our application, but we just have questions, and we're calling the technical assistance line, we're calling the grants officer, and we're not getting a response for days at a time. And we do some digging, and turns out you have 2 or 3 people being the technical assistance and support person for 5 or 6 grant programs at a time. So they're stretched thin as it is. And so this is not only about improving the customer experience and the training and helping folks get access to this important knowledge, but we really want to make sure that these hardworking sort of civil servants who are working their hardest to make grants accessible to underserved communities get the support that they deserve as well. So that's a summary of the bill. I want to talk a little bit about where we're at politically, because as you all know, anybody can introduce a bill and do a bunch of rah-rah shake and move on, and nothing really happens. But this bill actually has some legs, and Social Current and our partners at Independent Sector, the National Council of Nonprofits, and other nationwide nonprofits have been working very hard to make sure that this bill moves. On the Senate side of things, the bill was actually had a markup hearing in July. The bill passed out of markup with a bipartisan vote. Where it stands in the Senate right now is there's a real hope that this can be hotlined and passed by unanimous consent, which is sort of a testament to how non-controversial, bipartisan, nonpartisan, and really common sense the legislation is. We are dealing currently with holdups in 2 Senate offices, and we are working tirelessly with those offices. Senator Paul of Kentucky, the ranking member, has some issues, and Senator Scott of Florida has some issues as well. If you are from one of those states, I would love to talk to you about ways we can work together to influence your home state senators to really get something accomplished for the nonprofit community. But the hope is once those 2 folks' issues are resolved, that this passes by unanimous consent and is able to be hotlined in the Senate. In the House, it's a very different story. It has to go through the House Committee of Jurisdiction on this is oversight. And as you may or may not be aware, oversight is where both Republicans and Democrats stick some of their more eccentric members. So it's a very exciting committee, but it is a very ideological driven committee. So we are lucky that Republican staff on oversight has not poo-pooed the bill out of hand. They seem generally interested. I think that has to do with the fact that we do have a bona fide quote-unquote conservative Republican in Congresswoman Fox of North Carolina championing the bill. She has been broadly supportive of the nonprofit sector in Congress's past, and so we're hoping that by a really good blitz in the House, coordinating with Republican and Democratic staff, and really just driving home the bipartisan, nonpartisan, common sense nature of this legislation, that oversight could be persuaded to include this in a hearing. There has been talk already of doing a hearing on grant making in House oversight. More on that as it starts to emerge now that House Republicans have selected a speaker. So I will be in touch with Independent Sector and all national, regional, and local nonprofits who are interested in this piece of legislation to keep you abreast and help you figure out ways to dial in and advocate on behalf of a really nice piece of legislation that, while it's not fancy or sexy, it really has the opportunity to make a real difference for nonprofits nationwide. I'd be happy to take questions on this before I hop into another burgeoning piece of grant making policy that's making its way through DC. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Blair, for your insights and your and also your strategic leadership on this in this effort too. We're really glad to be in it with you. So people are asking if these excellent slides that boil down this complex issue are something that we can share with folks afterwards.
Yeah, I'd be happy to
Great.
share the slides, and I'd be happy to point to either Social Current or the National Council of Nonprofits, who has a wide array of one-pagers and resources on this piece of legislation.
So thank you. If people have other questions about this legislation, please fire away. I have a question, Blair, because this sounds like a great bill and my organization would like to help. How can I help? How can my organization help get this bill passed?
Well, an easy way to, I'm glad you asked that, Ben, because an easy way for national nonprofits to assist with this this effort outside of your own advocacy, which I'd love to help you coordinate, is we have a sign-on letter that is currently circulating amongst national nonprofits that is addressed to both Senate and House leadership, asking them to support the legislation and do what they can to move said legislation when the time comes to move it properly. And I believe that that is going to be shared in the box now. You can read the nonprofit coalition that Manuel has posted there. It's a letters written by yours truly. And there is a link that you can use to sign on, a Google form to sign on. And if you have questions or concerns about this letter and you are a national or multi-state nonprofit, I would love to discuss your concerns, questions, or comments.
Excellent. Thank you, Blair. I have a question from George at the Henry Ford about how this is related to the seat at the table legislation, which, Blair, I'm happy to tackle if you're good with that.
Yeah, that is your all's legislation, so go ahead.
So the seat at the table legislation, the Nonprofit Seat Act, introduced in the House of Representatives by Nancy Mace, who is a member of that House Oversight Committee, would set up a commission of experts on grant making to make recommendations for changes. It covers a lot of the same topics that the Streamlining Federal Grants Act covers. In all honesty, it covers them in much less detail and specificity than the Streamlining Federal Grants Act would. So, we certainly see the work that Blair and others have led in this legislation as sort of an amplification of the nonprofit sector's concern and focus on federal grants that was expressed, among many other things, through the Nonprofit Seat Act. We're really glad to have Social Current as an endorsing organization for that legislation too. And thank you all for the question and the answer about the House bill now.
The House bill, I will say, Ben, and whoever asked that in the chat, the actual text of the House bill is going to be slightly different because it does not reflect the amendments that were added to the bill during the markup. We are working on assisting both House and Senate pre-conferencing that piece of legislation, and that bill is not exactly live yet on Congress. The House text is not live yet on Congress.gov as of this morning.
Thank you. So, and Angela's asking for the sign-on letter link. That is the link, the most recent link that is in the chat. We'll share that again if that link isn't working. Blair, let's talk about other things that are also happening on this critical issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks that don't make this their life, and if you don't, I'm very glad that you don't. sort of tangentially, that's working very nice with this sort of boost of grants reform energy in the legislative branch. The executive branch has decided that they'd like to take a turn at this. So at the end of September, beginning of October, the Biden-Harris administration announced that they are going to propose significant changes to the Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Grants Guidance. That's going to aim to benefit nonprofits. It's going to really help out nonprofits who are just getting into the grant making process and the grant making game. And it's particularly going to address those costs, those issues related to everybody's favorite topic, indirect costs. And this is the actual proposal is a 250-page document. I'm not going to go through every single small detail of this. We're going to hit the high points, and then I'd be happy to take questions and assist. But the key thing that everybody's super excited for, and my brothers and sisters in the nonprofit community are very excited for, is what we're going to do to bolster federal requirements around indirect costs related to nonprofits. And the big sort of headline scream from the top of the mountains is that the new plan is going to raise the de minimis rate to a baseline of 15%. I know that's not anywhere close to the amount of the amount of rate that nonprofits need to really cover their actual indirect costs, but a 10 to 15% increase. We're slowly moving there. The White House seems broadly receptive to, and is really starting to listen through the efforts of organizations like independent sector, are really starting to listen to and put their ear to the ground on nonprofit issues. So I'm hoping that this is a good starting point and a place over the next 10 to 15 years we can really start to make waves for nonprofits. So we have that de minimis rate increase from 10 to 15%. That's going to benefit newer and experienced nonprofit. Another great one that's going to, again, benefit all organizations, but especially those newer organizations. The federal agencies cannot compel nonprofits to use a rate lower than 15% unless that is required by law. That's going to allow organizations to preserve their autonomy, to provide the necessary services in their community in a sustainable manner, to where that nonprofit is going to get the respect it's deserved. It's going to operate in the community in a evidence-based, community-based manner that makes sense for each community, and it's going to allow them to continue to operate for years to come. It's going to provide new avenues for dispute resolution through OMB and other federal agencies, again, protecting the rights of nonprofits. And there's going to be a stronger mandate. The language on this is strong. It could always be improved during the comment making process for this rule, but pass-through entities like states and local governments are going to have to adhere to that federally negotiated indirect cost rates for subrecipients, ensuring that there is consistency across agencies and that all agencies are playing by a level playing field. And sort of dovetailing with some of the really important things that we talk about in the streamlining federal grants legislation, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is proposing more clear communication, making notices of funding opportunities more clear and concise, requiring executive summaries and comprehensive explanations of program requirements instead of 2 or 3 sentence requirements that either require your organization to be very well adept in the federal grant process or spend hours on hold with the federal agency for questions and technical assistance. Eligibility criteria for each funding activity is going to be clarified. There's going to be more encouragement for agencies and recipients to engage with community members involving how we can improve the federal grant making process. Social Current has been trying to do this sort of in an ad hoc manner, most recently with an organization like the Department of Education and the Full Service Community Schools Grants Program. But it will be really nice to see that sort of template for how community engagement should occur be implemented federal government wide. Federal agencies are going to have to consider the diversity of the communities that these grants will be serving when they develop policies and procedures for merit review panels. And finally, again, agencies are going to be strongly encouraged to develop programs in consultation with impacted communities. And this is especially important to, I think, everyone, but to us at Social Current, who constantly hear from some of our human services, public health driven organizations that you can either apply for, apply for a grant that you know will get funded, or you can apply for the grant using techniques and proposing an idea that you know will be useful in the community. And sometimes those two things don't overlap. And so forcing federal agencies to consult with communities affected by what the grant will be serving will really allow for more innovative, exciting, hopefully improved helpfulness of grant applications and the programs that stream from them. And this is just a few other significant reforms. For those who get into the numbers on it, it's going to raise the single audit threshold from 750,000 to 1 million. And there's some really detailed, I encourage you to read it. It's very dense, but important, focusing on measuring relevant program performance and eliminating unnecessary reporting. I will tell you that if you're interested in getting involved in this comment period, I always encourage national, regional, and local nonprofits that I work with to participate in the federal rulemaking process, to provide comment. Read through this with your relevant counsel, your staff, your board members, and write a comment letter, giving your ideas, your concerns, and what you think should be improved with these proposed rules. Off the top of my head, it's going to be the end of November, beginning of December, before that comment period closes. I don't know off the top of my head the exact date, but if the whole writing a comment letter process is new to you, or just seems very cumbersome, or you are dealing with writing a comment letter right now, dealing with the Department of Labor's proposed overtime regulation revamps, then I have another sign-on letter opportunity for national nonprofits to hop onto. And it's actually going to be, the information should be popping up in the chat box right now, but it is a letter that is circulating among national nonprofits that is focusing really on making sure, while they're changing the uniform guidance regulations, that it also includes something that makes sure that if the Department of Labor's overtime regulations proposed rules go through, that there be an automatic adjustment in grants and contracts that are already existing in the federal government, so that that increase in cost of employee cost will be covered by the federal government and not be forced to be covered by a nonprofit that's already struggling to get by on the 10 to 15% indirect rate. So that letter is circulating as well. I would encourage you to read through it if you're a national or multi-state nonprofit. Look it over. If you have questions, you can reach out to me or my colleague, David Thompson, at the National Council of Nonprofits. But I'd be happy to take questions on this or anything else, social current, or I don't know sports, so I can't talk about baseball, but yeah.
Thank you, Blair. It's your depth of expertise on this is considerable. It's good to know your limits. Yeah.
Yeah. We trade grants for baseball.
There's a lot of important content here for folks to dig in on. We look forward to sharing these slides and these opportunities for engagement with you all and with folks who've registered and aren't with us live as well. So there will be chance to dig in and engage further. Last call for non-baseball questions for Blair. Blair Belkaiser, I want to thank you again for most of all for your partnership on this work and your leadership, and also for joining and sharing it with us today. Thanks again for joining.
No problem. Thank you all so much.
Blair. I want to now turn to Wes Coulomb and Jessica Cameron with Washington Council Ernst & Young. It has been a busy week on Capitol Hill. It was kind of busy in the headlines without anything really happening. But now there's real stuff going on. And those of us who like getting things done are glad to be moving forward. So Wes and Jessica, without stealing too much of your thunder, how do you see the landscape on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C. these days?
Well, good question, Ben. Definitely things have changed last 24, 48 hours in a different direction they were last couple of weeks. So things are kind of now moving forward on the appropriations process, legislative process. Obviously, the politics haven't changed since last couple of days, but some of the dynamics have a little bit, and so might see some additional movement taking place in the House and Senate. So maybe just have Jessica kick it off and talk about kind of what's happening in the Senate or on the House side with the events this week and what committee activities taking place and what legislation is moving. And I can kind of then follow up with that on the Senate side and see where things go after that. So Jessica, maybe kick it off on the House update.
Sure. Thanks, Wes. So after 22 days, we finally have a Speaker of the House. Never thought it would happen. I thought this would go on forever. I'm not sure about you. So kind of a relief that this process is over and the House can get back to work. So as background for those that are unaware, a few weeks ago, Speaker McCarthy was ousted by his own party. He negotiated a government funding patch with Democrats, which upset a number of folks within his own party. Problem is that there was no kind of obvious successor to McCarthy, and so what proceeded for the next 22 days was trying to find a replacement. We went through 4 different folks, the fourth one being, I guess, the charm in our new speaker, Mike Johnson. So a little bit about him. I think for a lot of people I've talked to, he's has been in Congress for several years now, but certainly has more of a quieter or has had a more quiet profile than maybe some other members of Congress. His district is in Shreveport, Louisiana. So certainly if you have operations or you're headquartered or have any activities that are down there, certainly something that will be important over the next few months. He also was previously in leadership and kind of the lower rungs of leadership. So he does have some experience, although certainly not with operating the job that entails maybe the whip or majority leader. I think important is that, there's not a whole lot about him that's understood in terms of his views on tax. And I say that also relating to nonprofits. And certainly with the job of speaker, he's going to have to expand his kind of issue areas to include things like foreign policy, as well as tax and government funding. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that all plays out. Previously, and he's kind of made a known, I think it's important to know that he's made his name with regards to focusing on socially conservative views. I won't get into those a whole lot, but certainly comes from Louisiana, so that's not a huge surprise. Again, I think the interesting piece will be how his views maybe change or shift, or the emphasis shifts as he moves over into speaker. A good example of this is, or a good corollary is that you see a lot of members of Congress who start in the House and maybe get elected to the Senate. They then represent a larger constituency in his or her state, and they tend to maybe calm down their views, or their views tend to shift based on the change in population that they now serve. So I think there's a lot more to come here in the next few months. Certainly, I think there are concerns, or it'll be interesting in terms of his fundraising going forward. 2024 will be a big year, and he's someone who hasn't had to really fundraising at the levels that the speaker is also required to do, kind of on the unofficial side. Moving forward towards appropriations, he recently laid out a plan of kind of an aggressive move to pass all 12 appropriations bills before November 17th. I think that's a pretty lofty goal, but certainly has kind of a viewpoint in place, with the idea that there could potentially be a CR for January or April of next year. So we'll see if that holds in November. I should also, just one last thing to point out is that the speaker, certainly has a different personality than the former speaker and comes from a different background. But the margins are still the same in the House, right? And so, all of the same uphill battles in terms of getting everyone on board with a funding patch, a tax bill, government funding, or even supplemental funding for disaster relief in Ukraine and Israel. the same kind of core issues are there. So maybe I'll just stop there. I know I said a lot, but I think it's important to kind of understand where that's coming from, because he will be a key player over the next 3 months, or if he stays longer than the last speaker, a few years.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, just a couple of notes on, Speaker Johnson, right? New, not totally new to Congress, been in 2016, but obviously new to leadership and new to a lot of people who expect him to rise this lofty level at this time. But, I think that there are people who are looking to see where his, issues are going to be and what he's going to focus on going forward. But at the end of the day, the politics really don't change, right? There's difficulty between the Democrats, Republicans in the House, Democrats in the Senate, and the White House versus the House Republicans on these issues, right? So the House is trying to move some appropriations bills one by one, as Jessica said. They're going to move them at lower levels than what the Senate is moving them at, and lower levels than the president has proposed. So we're still going to have the issue of trying to reconcile differences between the numbers and the policy on the various appropriations bills to get a deal by November 17th, or more likely, get a deal later on this year or early next year, as they probably have to punt the issue past November 17th to get more time to work on the bills that are not quite finished. Moving on the Senate side, the Senate is moving forward on, they passed out all the bills through the Appropriations Committee, and now are moving to the bills on the Senate floor. They're doing kind of a minibus process, doing a kind of 3 bills as a package at a time. They have currently on the Senate floor with a number of amendments pending to it. More votes taking place today. I think it's not going to finish until next week. Moving forward on the Milcon VA and housing appropriations bill. I expect that at some point to pass, and to move on to the next package after that. But the question, still remains: what happens November 17th? Will they get a deal by then? The answer is no. They're going to have to find some way to extend the CR past that date. So we're not going to have the appropriations bills done by that time. New Speaker Johnson floated possible extension of the CR into January or possibly April of next year. There's been some talk of maybe just doing it till December, to give some more time before the end of the year, which has been traditionally the way things have gone, right? October, November, December, and then they get a deal at the end of the before the end of the calendar year, before they break for the holidays and the year end. We'll see if that happens this year. There is kind of another wrinkle on appropriations process. As I said, the House is going lower, the Senate is going higher. But you do have a deal that was part of the debt limit bill earlier this year that would mandate a 1% across the board cut based off of 2023 levels on domestic and defense and non-defense appropriations in separate categories if they don't pass an appropriations bill by January 1st. Those sequester, what's called, amounts would kick in April, after the OMB has had time to analyze and publish the impact of that across the board cut. So there is some incentive, because the way that works is what would happen: the defense side of the ledger would get a significant cut if that happened. And interestingly enough, the non-defense part would actually go up compared to where the House Republicans are pushing at the moment. So there is an incentive for them to get a deal before that April timeframe to preserve a higher number on defense and also on non-defense appropriations as well. So that's kind of out there, and seeing how that plays out. So we also have a supplemental appropriations package that President Biden released last week, about $100 billion for Israel, Ukraine, disaster relief, etc. There's been some talk of splitting that package up, at least in the Senate Republican side, to 2 different bills: one for Israel by itself, and then move Ukraine, which does not have as much support as the Israel supplemental. And so talk about maybe moving those separately. But I think that, the view from a leadership standpoint is better have one vote, keep them all together, and just pass it and get it done as quick as possible if they can. President Biden has also talked about releasing a second supplemental, more domestic child support spending package as well, that I think will be released by the administration. I don't think it will get as much interest on the Republican side in the House and Senate, but it'll be out there and something to look forward to as they move this package to the House and Senate this next couple of months. So I think that's kind of where we are on the appropriations process, kind of, thinking about the year end and kind of where this goes, as I said, I think the November 17th date comes without a deal on appropriation. They have to then push that out to some date. I think there's talk of December, maybe January, maybe as far as April. I think probably January is probably the most likely place at this point. And traditionally they've done it to December. And that means the question, do they do a year-end package or year-end bill? And that really carries in past, Congresses, we've had the appropriations bill, an omnibus appropriations bill, kind of package everything together, and then a tax package would kind of be added to that and ride along that vehicle and have one big vote as they leave town and the big debate, and then they pass it on a bipartisan basis, the president's desk, before they leave town at the end of the year. One of the big objections to the Republicans and why I think Speaker McCarthy was removed is because of his willingness to maybe do an honest appropriations bill last year, and also willingness to do a deal with Democrats on a CR and appropriations. So I think there's nervousness in the House Republicans, especially about going down that same path again, and a lot of resistance to doing a big omnibus spending package that carries other things. And so I think there's some real risk that we don't have a year-end package. They do kind of plug along here and try to resolve some individual appropriations bills one by one between now and April of next year. I see that's kind of hard to actually do because they usually don't cut a deal on one until you deal on another, right? Because it's overall number. You give some appropriations bill more money, you got to take it from somewhere else if you're going to find it to figure out an overall number you have to agree to. So that's also challenging. But we're kind of something to need to watch, because the risk of having no year-end package is high. It's higher than it has in years past. That makes it hard to get some of the things done we want to get done on the tax space, other things to kind of ride along that bigger omnibus bill. So we'll have to watch that as it goes forward and progresses through the next several weeks. So I'll kind of stop there, and happy to answer any questions or talk about other things Ben wants to raise.
Wes, maybe before we answer questions, I did want to mention there's some activity on the House Ways and Means Committee this week that's important. Certainly there were several hearings, one dealing on Social Security Subcommittee, another on the Work and Welfare Subcommittee dealing with, kind of measuring poverty. The one I want to focus on, though, is they had a hearing at a full committee dealing with educational opportunities. The focus really being on K through 12, both on kind of where students are in terms of learning after the pandemic, school choice, and also talked about with a heavy emphasis on vocational training as an alternative to a four-year institution. There was kind of a mention in the beginning of Chairman Smith's statement about concerns over endowments in college universities, but really the focus was on K through 12 and vocational training. So certainly if any of the nonprofits listening now have thoughts on that or work in that space, I know that the Ways and Means Committee on both sides would welcome kind of your thoughts and opinions there, which are important. The last thing I'll say is that on charitable giving, which is something that a lot of folks are very much concerned about. I will say that the education hearing on Wednesday, a JCT report was put out that I'm happy to send to Ben if you would like to look at it, dealing with a lot of tax exempt provisions that affect K through 12 schooling. And a lot of those are ones I think we've seen before, the gift tax exclusion, charitable giving, and a few other things. So kind of a nice broad overview of some of the issues that we're looking at in the sector that I think are important to note. Certainly with regards to charitable giving and a year-end package, like Wes mentioned, it really is determined on whether step one, there's a bill that a tax package could attach to. And I think there's a big question mark there of whether that'll happen at the end of the year. The second thing I think will be the overall cost of the bill if it does end up moving forward. Certainly Democrats have been focused on the child tax credit, and that's a rather expensive provision to move, even just a straight extension with refundability. And so kind of figuring out what the dollars and cents look like there will be important. We've got some great partners on the Hill, like Senator Langford and others that are really pushing that, but something that we continue to monitor.
Yeah, also just on the hearing front, there was a hearing yesterday in the Senate Finance Committee on paid leave. Jocelyn Fry, the president of National Partnership for Women and Families, testified in that hearing, focused on ways to help employees get paid, family medical leave. Obviously, the big issue that came out during COVID, during the pandemic, I think something is ongoing need for individuals, employers to work together on to provide paid leave to employees. So it's something that's like focused on the Senate Finance Committee. I think more focused on like bipartisan support for that. There's spending issues, also a tax credit that was put in place a while back. So there's ways to help, and there's interest in trying to do that. The question is how that gets done. I'm not sure, but the hearing kind of focus on ways to move the ball forward on paid leave.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Wes. So there's a lot of balls in the air for legislators. Even the House of Representatives didn't take the last 22 days off. And we've heard that, right, there's some bills like the Streamlining Federal Grants Act that might be able to move without a larger package. But there are a lot of other bills that rely on having a larger package. So this context that isn't always encouraging, but it's critical for us to understand, and it certainly can change at a moment's notice. We have a question from Ryan about the 1% across the board cut. Can you talk a little bit more in detail about how Speaker Johnson will approach that? I will note one of the things I've learned about Speaker Johnson in the last 24 hours is that he has at least a couple significant military bases in his district in Western Louisiana that might play into some decisions here too.
Yeah, sure. So, go ahead, Wes.
Yeah, so the 1% cut, just a little bit about it, right? It was put in place in the debt limit negotiation between the Republicans and the president. Really is an action forcing event because the way that it's structured is it's keyed off of going back to 2023 appropriation numbers and then a 1% cut off after that. So the external results of that would be a dramatic reduction in the defense spending number. So Republicans who want more defense spending would see a big cut from defense spending. Interestingly enough, the 23 number for non-defense would then go up above where the Republicans want to cut it in their bills. They put forward so far in appropriations process. So from a Republican standpoint, I think it's it might sound nice from the fiscal hawk to have a 1% cross-board cut, but I think it actually does the opposite of what they want to do from their appropriations bills, and that's less defense and more non-defense, right? So I think it's kind of a action forcing mechanism there. I think that Speaker Johnson, where Jessica might be going here, is he wants to have regular order, pass the bills one by one, and then have a negotiation to find a deal to avoid the 1% cut, avoid this trigger taking place, this sequester happening next year. But it's out there, and hopefully it will help them come together on a bipartisan basis to reach a deal on appropriations package before January 1st, at least before April, right? January 1st when it actually becomes effective, but doesn't really kick in, actually start cutting spending until April. So they have a little time to negotiate after January 1st to figure something out on a bipartisan basis. Jessica?
Only thing I'll say is that this whole process starts all over again next year. So if we don't pass, whatever happens this year, let's say we do pass all 12 appropriations, the 1% cut does not kick in April, but then we get to 2024 and we, December 31st, 2024, and we have not passed all 12 appropriations bills, the same thing, you suffer a 1% cut on both defense and non-defense. So we're not out of the woods yet. It's a 2-year kind of, not requirement, but a 2-year shtick here.
A two-year budget cap that was agreed to by large bipartisan majorities.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think shtick is the more formal
That's right.
vocabulary term for it, but we'll take budget cap. That's actually the better word.
Yeah. Just pointing out the previous bipartisan agreement around these budgets that cost at least one guy's job.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Thank you, Wes and Jessica. Other questions on the swirling federal tax and spending landscape at the moment? I know that, Jessica mentioned the Charitable Act and independent sector and social current and others have been, working real hard to build bipartisan, bicameral support for that legislation on Capitol Hill. Our colleague Ana Montañez was tapped for jury duty today, has been, leading that for us, and we'll keep at that for when the opportunity does present itself.
So the question, Ben, maybe is what can pass, right? I think that you're hitting on that point is what can pass is legislation that's bipartisan in the House and the Senate or has a pressing need, right? Obviously, I think Israel and Ukraine support happens at some point. Disaster relief is going to happen, right? They're going to do some things on those big pressing issues, as well as, I think, still work on smaller bipartisan bills that can pass both in the Senate and the House, right? The Senate, usually has to do things by unanimous consent, so it really must be very bipartisan in order to move without a big vote process, because time on the floor of the Senate is very precious and usually taken up, a lot of time, especially the next couple weeks, by appropriations bills that take a lot of time because they have to have votes and debate and so forth. And so, moving a bill to the Senate is a cumbersome process, as well as nominations that the leader and the president want to get done as well by the end of the year. So that takes up additional time. In the House, it really have to be things on suspension where they have votes without debate, need to get 2/3 of the House to vote for it. So things that are non-controversial, bipartisan, I think will still move on a regular basis to the House, even while they're doing their appropriations bills. The appropriation bills in the Senate are going to be bipartisan, passed on a bipartisan basis. In the House, they're going to be only partisan. They're going to be passed only by Republicans, and they're going to have to figure out a way to then come together and negotiate a final bipartisan deal, because anything that's going to have to get done into law has to pass a Democrat-controlled Senate, Republican-controlled House, and President Biden.
I know we are running short on time, so I'll say last call for questions, and I'm going to turn to a couple other final updates, unless people jump in with a question before I finish. I want to note, and this is something that Blair noted as well, that the Department of Labor's overtime rulemaking is still open for comments. Those comments are due November 7th. This is a proposal to increase the salary threshold for potential exemption from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act for salaried employees from about $35,000 a year to about $55,000 per year. So any employee earning less than that will be entitled to overtime when they work over 40 hours a week, if this goes into effect. The rough expectation is that the effective date will be sometime next summer. So we will be commenting on that, and we urge nonprofits to weigh in and to think about how that would impact your mission, whether it would help or would hurt your mission, and to make sure you're on that record. The next update, the final update that I have for you all, is just a note that another issue of importance to the nonprofit sector, the volunteer mileage rate, has gained some additional traction with Senate legislation being introduced by Senator Klobuchar, Senators Budd and Tina Smith. That tracks with previous House legislation introduced that would just increase the charitable mileage rate for people who volunteer their time and use their vehicle to do it, from the paltry 14 cents per mile that it is set at in statute to the 65.5 cents that the IRS is allowed to adjust on a regular basis for businesses. So just some fairness there for volunteer drivers. That legislation is S3020. The Volunteer Driver Tax Appreciation Act, gaining momentum. And with that, we are at 3 o'clock. We are so grateful to you for spending your time with us on this beautiful Washington, D.C. afternoon. We know it's a busy one. Thank you to Blair. Thank you to Jessica. Thank you to Wes. And most of all, thanks to you all for the work you do day in and day out. We're so proud to advocate with you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks all.